Hi, this is Chris Young. Welcome to episode 114 of Contemplating Life. In this episode, I continue my series recounting my efforts to maintain my Medicare benefits and to live in a safe, comfortable environment. When I left off last episode, we had just established a trust fund that would allow me to inherit money when my dad passed away, and it would not affect my Medicare or Medicaid benefits. All we did was execute the documents to establish the trust. We obtained an employer identification number, or EIN. It's a way to identify your business or other legal entity, the same as the way an individual is identified by their Social Security number. We decided not to put any money into it until we had to, so we didn't open a bank account. The trust only existed on paper as a legal entity with no assets. In those days, Medicaid conducted an annual review of every recipient. You had to inform them of any increases in your income or any other changes that could affect your eligibility. I decided I should tell them about the trust. I didn't want to be in a position where, perhaps 5 or 10 years in the future, Dad passed away, we put money in the trust, and then they discovered it existed for years, and I hadn't informed them. They canceled my Medicaid because I refused to give them a bank statement for the trust. I kept resubmitting documents and explaining in cover letters that there was no money and no bank account. Okay, time out. I can't resist. Here's an opportunity to tell one of my favorite jokes that I've told hundreds of times. In fact, earlier today, on the day I wrote this, I told the joke. But I've never told it in this podcast, so here goes. A guy walks into an ice cream store and orders a gallon of chocolate. The clerk says, "I'm sorry, sir. We've had a big run on chocolate today, and we're totally out." He says, "Okay, give me a quart of chocolate." "No, I'm sorry, I wasn't clear. We don't have any chocolate whatsoever. We have over 30 other flavors, but we're totally out of chocolate." "Well, then give me a pint of chocolate." The clerk says, "Sir, can you spell the van in vanilla?" He goes, "VAN. Okay, can you spell the straw in strawberry?" "Yeah, STRAW. Now, can you spell the fuck in chocolate?" There is no fucking chocolate." "That's what I've been trying to tell you. There's no fucking chocolate." And there was no fucking money in the trust fund and no fucking bank account. Anyway, I finally got it through their thick heads that there was no money. Eventually, the state of Indiana quit doing detailed annual reviews of everyone. If you'd been on Medicaid for a while and had passed all their previous reviews, they decided they could just rubber stamp your continuation of benefits and trust under the pain of the law that if there were any significant changes, you would report them. I can't recall when the last detailed review of my case occurred. However, they're cracking down now, and everyone has to be reviewed and recertified. My recertification was supposed to occur last month, March 2026. If I don't complete the recertification by the end of April, I'm writing this on April 8th, I will lose my benefits. But that's getting ahead of the story. Things went relatively smooth for the first few years. Dad stayed in relatively good health for his age. I had a few health scares along the way that we'll chronicle in other episodes someday. But briefly, I had a hole rupture in my intestine in 2006. I had a G-tube placed in May of 2016. I got my trach in December 2016, and my suprapubic catheter in September of 2019. I also had a bunch of nasty bouts with respiratory issues or pneumonia, as well as countless urinary infections, some of which required hospitalization. As previously mentioned, we went through countless home health aides and home health care agencies over the years, and I can't begin to remember all of the details. One agency that I had to fire was because the office personnel consistently lied to me. And I'll never forget this story. The problem was the woman who was in charge of scheduling. I'm tempted to use her real name because I don't care if I expose her as an incompetent, dispassionate liar that she was. But I'll try to be kind, and we'll make up a name and call her Jane. I had a very reliable aide. Sadly, I don't remember her name. As with many of my people, things come up. They have doctor's appointments, their children get sick, their car breaks down, or for whatever reason, they might need the day off. We had also trained a backup aide who I really liked. Again, I don't remember her name either. She could occasionally squeeze me in between two other clients. I knew that when she filled in, she could not be here at my usual time of 9 a.m. The soonest she had ever gotten here was about 9:50. On the day in question, Dad was having cataract surgery. I had some family friends who were going to stay with me. On a day which I was quite nervous about my dad's surgery, I had the added frustration that my regular gal couldn't be there. I called the office, and Jane said she would call the backup person. Jane said the backup would be here at 9:30. I didn't think that could be right, but I took her at her word. When the backup aide arrived around 10 a.m., I told her what Jane said. The aide said, "Yeah, I know what she told you. I was on the other line talking to her when she said that." I screamed at her. "I told you the absolute soonest I could be there was 9:45, and it would probably be 10. But Jane didn't care. She told you an absolute lie, and she knew better." By the way, Jane never answered the phone when I called her direct number. I always had to leave a voicemail and wait for her to call me back. On one occasion, I called her about a schedule change that was 2 weeks away. She never returned my call. That's when I went to a different agency. I should have mentioned earlier, there was an agency that provided case management services for me. The Central Indiana Council on Aging, or SACOA, helped me with my initial Medicaid application. They would do routine in-home visits to see if I was getting the services I needed or if there were any problems. And once a year, they would do a major review of my needs, and we would set goals for the year. Primarily, my goals were to continue living in my own home, stay out of the hospital, and continue enjoying the social activities that I liked, such as going to concerts, movies, and enjoying my hobbies. They provided these case management services from 2008, when I first applied for Medicaid, until September 2025, when case management was taken over by someone else. More details on that story another time. I had a variety of case managers with SACOA over the years. They enjoyed working with me because I didn't need much. The only time I needed help was when I had to fire an agency. In the case I just described, they asked me, "Do you want us to notify the agency that you've quit them and are going with someone else?" I said, "Well, normally I'd say yes. Let's have you do it for me. However, this time I want to call them and leave a voicemail to explain in no uncertain terms why I'm leaving." I did that. I called the office, and I explained in no uncertain terms that Jane had lied to me on multiple occasions, and she had not returned my call for over 2 weeks. She was the sole reason I was leaving their agency. I told them if they didn't do something about it, I wouldn't be surprised if they continued to lose clients because of her. Jane called me back this time. She explained she had been on vacation or leave or something, and she didn't get my message. "That's not my problem," I explained. "You should have someone monitoring your voicemail. And the fact that you didn't, or they were incompetent in doing so, is further reason why I can't do business with you anymore. But let me be clear. You, Jane, are the primary reason I'm leaving." I don't recall exactly what her response was. I think she made some sort of apology, but it was more along the lines of, "I'm sorry we couldn't meet your needs," not, "I'm sorry I'm a lying bitch." Jane said if I ever wanted to come back to that agency, they would welcome me back. I said, "Not as long as you're working there." I got tremendous satisfaction from telling her she was the reason I left. I later told this story to a friend at church, a woman named Tina Grannon, who was a nurse. I was surprised to learn that Tina had previously worked at that agency. She confirmed that I wasn't the first and probably wouldn't be the last client that they lost because of Jane. The problem was that Jane was best friends with the company's owner and probably would never be fired. Other times that I had to fire an agency were not as dramatic. In most cases, they simply didn't have any employees who could meet my needs and my scheduling. They would try to hire new people, but often it didn't work out. This story is a bit out of sequence in my timeline, but it's a good time to tell it. One of the agencies sent me a petite 61-year-old woman. Now, typically, it takes about 15 to 20 minutes, tops, to give me a bed bath. It took her over 30 minutes to bathe me. I could tell she wasn't going to have enough strength to wrestle me into my back brace or reposition me in the wheelchair once she lifted me with a Hoyer lift. So I thanked her, sent her on her way, and spent the rest of the day in bed. I told the agency, "Try again." The next day, they sent me a young lady who was extremely nervous. She was frightened to touch me. We tried to reassure her that we could train her how to do the job safely without hurting me. The first task was to undress me. Overnight, I wear a white undershirt, underpants, and socks. I told her to pick up my leg by the calf and take off my socks. She turned to my roommate, Barb, and asked, "Show me how to do it." By the way, we'll talk more about Barb and how she came to be my roommate in another episode. Anyway, Barb showed her. Then the aide very timidly picked up my other leg and peeled off my sock. By the time she had completed that task, she was nearly in tears. She apologized, explained that she had told them she was uncomfortable doing extensive care. She previously had done things like housekeeping or companion care, which is just sitting with the elderly client and keeping them company, perhaps fixing them lunch. She wasn't going to be able to do the job. We thanked her and sent her on her way. Reluctantly, shortly thereafter, we moved to a different agency. They were highly apologetic, explained they simply couldn't find the right person for me. It was an amicable split. Another time, I signed up with an agency, and the owner said she would be my caregiver until she could find someone to take over my care. That proved to be much more difficult than she anticipated. In those days, I was getting help 7 days a week, both in the morning and the evening. She would get me up in the morning, and her husband, who also worked for the company, would put me to bed at night. By the way, I had an embarrassing moment with them. I always try to engage my caregivers in conversations, ask about their families, spouses, children, whatever. This couple had been working for me for about 2 weeks before I realized they were husband and wife. They both talked about their spouses, but I didn't make the connection. It was really embarrassing when the guy told me, "That's my wife." Working 7 days a week while running the business became quite a challenge for her. I loved working with her, but I could see the strain. She began regularly asking for Sunday off for church activities, and I agreed to stay in bed on those days. After this went on for a couple of months, she told me that she, her husband, and children were planning a trip to their home country, Nigeria, to visit family for most of the month of December. It was about 5 or 6 weeks until they planned to leave. I explained to her we'd spent months trying to find someone to take over my care and had been unsuccessful. Even if we found someone before they left for their overseas trip, we had no backup. If something went wrong, they were going to be halfway around the world, and I wouldn't have any backup. I had to sign up with a different agency now, while I still had the opportunity, and they completely understood. Speaking of Nigeria, many people from that country enter the healthcare business. I've had at least 6 people from Nigeria work for me over the years. I've also had several others from Nigeria in hospitals who cared for me. One of them stands out as quite memorable. He was a very tall, muscular man who said I should call him Mr. Deli. He explained I probably couldn't pronounce his African name. He worked for me for about 6 months in the summer and fall of 2010. The reason I can remember that date is that while he was feeding me lunch every day, we watched the FIFA World Cup from South Africa. And he was very excited that it was being held in Africa for the first time. One day I asked him what his real name was, and he said, Babadeli Alawali. I said, who, the what, the what, the who? He laughed and said, I told you so. I asked him to write it down, and once he did, I read it perfectly. See the transcript or the YouTube version to see the spelling. He was one of many people who had to move on because he wasn't getting enough hours. He had an opportunity for a 40-hour-a-week job at LaRue Carter Mental Hospital. They needed big, strong men who could handle the unruly patients. A few weeks ago, Deli reached out to me because he needed help with his laptop. He wanted to see if it had any viruses or unnecessary programs slowing it down. Then he told me about some serious health issues he'd been facing. He had a heart problem that required him to be put on a left ventricular assist device, or LVAD. He had to carry a battery pack around with him when he went out, or he stayed plugged in to a battery charger overnight at home. He has a preteen daughter who he's raising. I'm not sure how he's making ends meet. He was just happy to be alive after all the things he'd been through. And I was happy to see him again, and to know he was okay despite his difficulties. So let's recap. The last episode, I told you about Raya and Rick, both who had to quit for medical reasons. There will be more stories of caregivers with medical issues in future episodes. I promise you, I'm not that hard on people, but they keep breaking. At the end of the previous episode, I hinted we would be talking about my father's death, and I managed to avoid it for this episode. But next time, we'll dive in and address it. So as always, if you find this podcast educational, entertaining, enlightening, or even inspiring, consider sponsoring me on Patreon for just $5 a month. You'll get early access to the podcast and other exclusive content. I'm not in this for the money, but every bit helps. As always, my deepest thanks to my financial supporters and everyone who supports me in any way. That means more to me than words can express. Even if you can't provide financial support, please post links and share this podcast. I just want to grow my audience. All my back episodes are available, so check those out. And give me any comments, questions, or other feedback wherever you found the podcast. I'll see you next time as we continue contemplating life. Until then, fly safe, everyone.